This week's episodes were brought to you by the generous support of Eric Sumner. Hey folks, Quillyteen here, and welcome to another episode of our mostly civilized Hex engine series here in Unity, where we make, a Hex-based game. Well, the base engine for a Hex-based game. We've still got it set up so that we can select a character right now, which is lovely. If, I actually click on the right tile, there we go. And, I can give him some instructions to move, and I can hit the spacebar button to sort of go through this move one at a time, but we still don't have a turn-based logic, and we want to work up to that. But I think in preparation for that, I'm going to work on getting in a little user interface to show us that we've got a person selected. We're also going to go ahead and put in a semi-placeholder button for our sort of next turn functionality, which is currently mapped to the spacebar, which might still be mapped to the spacebar, honestly, but I want to have a button there to do it. So we're going to add a user interface, which we've done before. We're going to go to Game Object, and to start off with, you just need a canvas, but as soon as you add any UI element whatsoever, you're going to get a canvas put in already. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a big giant button in the bottom right corner. So let's go and create the button right away. And it's much easier to edit the user interface if you go into 2D mode, because it'll make sure you're oriented correctly. And then if we double click on the button, we've got it there. And in fact, if we zoom out, we'll actually see our window. This canvas will change size and shape depending on our actual game window over here. And we need to put this button inside there. So I think this button is going to get bopped down to the bottom right corner. So if you click this little anchor preset and you hold Alt and Shift, then that's an easy way to just lock the button to the bottom right corner of the screen, which is what I think we want. So we'll do that. And I'm thinking we're going to set this one up to be kind of square. Maybe even with 160 by 160. That might be too big. I think we're going to want like a cooler looking, maybe rounder button. Do I have one actually? I do. So I'm going to be using the Kenny asset pack for some graphics and things. And there are some little circle bits. I think what we'll do is figure out something like that. I brought in some blue squares for some panels and things. So maybe I'll bring in blue circle here as well. Let me go and say that it's a sprite. Sprites are used for the user interface system and whatnot. So in our canvas, we have a button. Now, what is a button? We've looked at that before. A button is basically two UI elements. It's an image as a background, and then typically also a text label, although we could also put another image in there to be sort of an icon for an action, that sort of thing. I don't think we're going to draw those graphics in here, but we're going to start by replacing the background of the button graphic here. I'm going to go and for the source image, I'm going to click on blue circle. So we've got it there. Okay, so the circle is a bit low res for this, but I don't know, it's fine. I suppose I could whip one up real quick in Photoshop, but let's not. Let me just set this to maybe 100 by 100 instead, something like that. And so this is basically the next turn button over here. Nicely centered and whatever. Good, excellent. So we've got that, and then next to it, I want to put a little panel on there that's going to be present when we've got a unit selected. So on the canvas itself, I'm going to right click, I'm going to UI. Now, a panel, which is available in here, panel and image is exactly the same thing. Panel tends to be semi-transparent, and by default, it sets it to be like the full size of the canvas. I'll just go and set it as a default image. Either way, it makes no difference. It's just a rect transform with an image script, regardless whether you go panel or not. So I want this thing to also be anchored to the bottom right corner. I'll just Alt and Shift both. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this over this way. So it's still going to be anchored to the bottom right corner, but it's going to have space for the button. I guess I'll move it over a few more pixels here just so that there's a bit of gap before the button. Let me bring that to a nice even number. So there we go, something like -0.5. So I guess there'll be a 5 pixel gap between the button and the panel. That's okay. And then we're going to go ahead and extend it this way. We'll make it, I don't know, 200. That's probably bigger than we want. 200 pixels wide by 100 pixels tall. I'm sure that's groovy. And I'm going to change the sprite to use the blue panel sprite that I brought in from the Kenny assets. Kenny.nl is a nice source of Creative Commons free graphics. But our image mode is not what we're looking for here. Right now, it just took this blue panel, this square panel, and it has just stretched it. But we can see that because it's a rectangle and not a square, that it's stretched unevenly. Also, we don't really want the border to get stretched by this. So what are we going to do? Instead of using the panel as is, as a simple image, we really need it to be a 9-sliced graphic. but does require you to have a border. So what are we talking about? We're going to go into the blue panel here in our project. We're going to go into the sprite editor, and what we're going to do is give it a border. I'm just going to pull the border down to anywhere. See, like there's a bit, might be a little hard to see on YouTube. I don't know how well the colors are going to translate, but this is all solid color, and over here in the corner there's some gradients going on. I'm going to pull this divider line to just under, so all the gradient bits are above this line. We're going to do the same thing on the bottom, if I can maybe do it. Looks like there's one extra pixel there. So it looks like it needs 6 pixels to grab all the gradient at the bottom, and maybe only 5 at the top. But I'm going to go ahead and make it square. So we'll have a border of 6 pixels on the top and bottom, and on the same on the other side too. You don't have to have the borders literally be the same depending on how you want to use it, but it'll look better in the end if we do it. So we're going to do that. We're going to apply. So now this image has a border, and then what's great about this is that our image over here is using that border to generate a rectangle where no matter how I stretch it, so if I stretch it wider, you'll see that it still just has that 6 pixel border that has a constant width on the side there, same on the height. Looks great for that sort of thing. I'm going to be very happy with it. I'm just going to switch this back to 200 by 100 here because I was happy with that height. All right, so we got a little panel, and so this is going to be something like the selection panel or something like that. And in it, we're going to go and throw in, I don't know, some sort of text thing like selected unit or whatever. Let's go and tell it to be anchored in the top left corner of this. But we'll go ahead and give it a margin of, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and create an empty inside the selection panel. I'm going to click on the rect transform. I'm going to hold Alt and Shift and tell it to be stretched 100%. So we have just this empty game object here. This is going to be sort of our content area. And I'm going to give this a border of that 6 pixels on each side. By doing that, if we take our text and we put it inside the content area, and I tell this text to be anchored in the top left corner of the content area, then it's going to have the correct border to not overlap with the edge of the panel, and everything will look a little sexier. Then you can tweak the size and dimensions of the content area if you decide you want to change your border for everything. It stops you from having to individually place each sub-item. So for this, we're going to want this to be fully wide that way and to have some sort of height. So it's going to have, you know, some unit in there in the name. And then what else are we going to have? I guess this would be something like, we'll just relabel this title. And then another text object. Actually, I guess what I'll do is I'll just take the existing one. I'll duplicate it. And so this will be something like movement. I'm just going to move it down to here. Movement. So it's like 99 of 99 as a placeholder. Something like that. And it could have extra stats later on, but that's what we want. So when we have a unit selected, I want this to show up and tell us the current movement stats that are in there. Maybe as a bit of a debug, we'll have something like Q length. Like this is our hex path length. Just have some debug info available. Change the label of this. Like that. Cool. Okay. Oh, and we got to move you down. Like that. I like to type in the numbers just to make sure that I've got the space to put them in there. So I tend to just use some big number. That'll clearly be okay. All right, so let's tie this into our selection. Now, one of the questions will potentially be, where should the logic of this panel be? Okay, because think about it. Our mouse controller is the thing that's responsible for detecting if something gets selected or not. Should the mouse controller be responsible for turning this panel on and off? Or instead, should the selection panel constantly check to see if something is selected? In the latter case, what we can't do is we can never disable the selection panel, because if we do, the selection panel's update will never run, and therefore it'll never be aware if anything is selected. There's a couple of different ways to handle that. What we could do is add a canvas group to this object, in which point what we can do is we could turn down the alpha to hide it, and we'd also probably want to disable the interactable and block raycast on there. I think that's not exactly what we're looking for in this case. So I think what we're going to do is we'll probably have the mouse controller script determine whether or not this object is visible. I think that's probably fine. In the end, I don't think it matters much. I think you write exactly the same amount of code, and I don't think that any one approach is more or less messy. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make a public game object, and this is the unit selection panel in here. And when we have functions for setting a selected unit, don't we? No, we don't. I guess we just set the selected unit directly. This might be a good example for a property then. Because I don't like to use properties when there's a real side effect, but here the side effect is really independent of the code logic. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's convert the selected unit into a property. So what we're going to do is, I'm just going to duplicate this. I'm going to make the actual value have a couple leading underscores as a hint of like, don't use this directly. And this selected unit is going to be a property, even though it's still just protected, like it's not available to everyone. The get is just going to return selected unit, and the set is going to set selected unit to the value. And in addition to that, it's going to say to the unit selection panel dot set active true. Well, actually, it's going to set active to true if selected unit is not a null. So we can actually just say that if selected unit is not equal to null. So if selected unit isn't null, then this returns true, which means we've set active. If it is null, then this will evaluate to false, which means we set active to false. So this turns the selection panel on and off depending on whether or not something is selected. So this is going to require for us to go and link to the mouse controller here that, hey, you've got a selection panel, which is this. The other way I would do it, if the logic were inside the selection panel, I would have it probably find the mouse controller at runtime and just sort of auto-link for some stuff, but that should be okay. Now, the selection panel itself needs some sort of code to run. I think I'm probably just going to go ahead and add a unit selection panel component over here. I'm going to make a folder finally for scripts. And actually, let me go and before I do this, I'm going to close all these windows because they'll be slightly confused. For scripts, and then inside of that, I'm going to have a separate folder for the user interface. So then I'm going to take all these, move them in there. And the unit selection panel specifically is UI code. Now, I mean, to a certain extent, maybe the mouse controller is user interface. And I mean, this is how the user interfaces with things. But usually when people are talking about UI, they actually mean the GUI, the graphic user interface. So I'll just use this for here. It's going to be fine. Okay, so the selection panel has a script on it, which is great. I'm going to get it to load, load, load. Thank you very much. Embiggen. I'm going to get to have 3 public properties. Public, so hang on. We need to do things with the UI namespace. So public text. So we've got the title. We've got the public text for movement and the public text for, what is it? Oh, the hex path. So these 3 text elements are going to be present as part of our selection panel. Now, we could have the selection panel find these things by name or something, but we're going to go ahead and link these actual text fields to there. So I could have had this be a public game object, and then somewhere either in the start or the update, you know, do the game objects.get component text, etc., etc. But by doing this, we have access to the text component right away. And it also makes sure you actually can't put something that doesn't have a text component into one of these fields. You can see it's forbidden. Not allowed to put these in here. Only things that have an actual text component can be dropped into these things. So, you know, keeps it a little neater, and that's going to be A-okay. All right, so your job is just while you're running, you are... Oh, we need to have a copy of the mouse controller. And I guess this can find it at runtime. That's going to be okay. So on start equals GameObject.find, or we can have the mouse controller feed it into a public field, but that's okay. Find object of type mouse controller. So it'll find the first thing in our hierarchy that's got a mouse controller component, save it in there. This should work just fine. And so every round we're going to say if Well, first of all, we should only be running if mouse controller does actually have a selected unit, because otherwise we've been set to disabled. But it still might be worth checking. But we need to get access to the selected unit. So I think the selected unit, I think we'll just make it public. You know, encapsulation is all good and well, but I don't think it makes much of a difference. So we'll make it a public, and we'll have the set be protected. I think that's going to be okay. Although, maybe we'll change this around. Maybe later on, there'll be some sort of other logic that sets... Actually, there will be. We are going to want this public. And here's the reason why we want selected unit to be public. So I'm going to change this to a capital S, because just by convention, you tend to make public things have a capital letter. The reason I want it to be public is because you can easily imagine, right, this next turn button, it's actually going to serve multiple purposes. If there's a unit waiting for instructions, instead of saying next unit, it's going to be like unit waiting, you know, for orders. And if you click on this, it should automatically select the next unit waiting for orders. So this button here will set the selection order and probably also zoom the camera to look at that unit. So I think we will need that aspect to be public in there, and I think that's going to be groovy and fine. Okay, so now having done that, now that selected unit is public in our unit selector, we'll just do a little check. That selected unit not equals null. You know, we'll only run this code if it's not. Again, update shouldn't be running if selected unit is null, but there might be a weird timing issue or something, so we'll go ahead and verify it. That's going to be all right. And other than that, we're going to be setting title.text is going to be equal to, you know, I don't even think we have to write like all the selected unit, blah, 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 everything like that. I think the title could just literally be the selected units dot name over there. And let's see, we're going to have the movement and the hex path. Oops. Hex path movement. Set all their text. Let's go ahead and just line this up so it looks pretty. So your movement is going to be movement remaining plus... I should probably use a string.format for this, actually. So item 0 / item 1. So the first value is going to be the movement remaining. The second plus controller dot selected unit dot movement. So that's the total raw movement or the maximum movement. There we go. I know it's like when I've been big in the text, it can be hard to read all this, but what I can do, I suppose, is just say, here's the format. Here's value 1 or 0 and 1 over there. Like that. There we go. That'll look a little bit better, probably. And then for the hex path, we want to know hex path. Get hex path. Okay, we don't want to call hex path more than once, and we've got a couple of things to check for it. So we're going to say hex array hex path is equal to this. And then in here, we want it, if hex path is equal to null, then we want to we'll just write 0. That's going to be fine. Otherwise, we return hex path dot length in here, and we just feed that into here. It'll auto convert this integer to a string, I think, but we'll do it explicitly. To string. Okay. Compilation errors? Nope. Okay. Now this selection panel should actually start, you know, disabled. Doesn't really matter too much, but that's, well, I mean, it does. It's not supposed to show until we select a unit. We select a unit, it shows up. Dwarf 2 of 2 with no hex path. If I go ahead and do this, hex path is now 7. So there's still the question as to whether or not when we let go of this dwarf's, what's causing the actual error when we click here? Oh, because units is null until we assign the first one, which is fine. If units is equal to null, then just return null. Or we could ensure that it gets instantiated, but this is fine. Okay, so we'll have to just stop, start again. Just confirm now that when we click on an empty tile, Oh, null. This can be null. So if US... Well, here's a question. Do we actually want it to return just an empty array if it's null? No, that's fine. If it's not null and it's greater than 0. I don't know. We might want to make some sort of logic change to that later on to make it so that if a tile... You know what? I'm going to have it so our hex is here. We're going to instantiate our units list in the constructor. That way, we never have to worry about units being null. It'll be an empty set. Like it'll always be a list or a hash set or whatever. It will never be an empty one, or it'll sometimes be empty, but it'll never be null. Okay, there. No more errors. We select you. You've got the stats over there. If I give you a path and I select you again, it tells me that your path is now 6. Good stuff. That's exactly what I'm looking for here. Yeah, so we break the selection every time we exit a mode. That's clearly not what we want. So, all right, our, what is it? What do we call it? Cancel update func here. This is where we deselect the unit. So we don't want that. So when do we deselect a unit? I mean, certainly when we hit escape or whatever. Probably. Yeah, so here's escape. This is where we can cancel mode with the save. I guess at that point we would set selected unit to be null then. And I'm not accidentally using the double underscore version of it anyway, right? No. So the only way to not have a unit selected anymore is to just hit escape. Otherwise, it's going to be a sticky selection. I think that sounds more reasonable. Let's see. Select you. Do that. You're still selected, which means we still see your path. I mean, there should be an auto cycling thing, right? Normally, if you select a unit and you give it a command and it completes its move, and it has no more movement yet, the game will auto cycle to the next unit. That's fine. But in the case where a unit, say, has 2 units of movement, and you take and you right-click over here, the unit slides over here, still has movement, so it shouldn't auto-cycle to the next one. Auto-cycling is different from, like, not having a sticky selection tool, though. So I can do this, I can now pan around, and it doesn't deselect the dwarf, it doesn't deselect them until I hit escape. There. I think that's closer to the kind of behavior that we want. And again, at some point, there'll be some sort of, like, cycle to the next unit waiting for commands tool, which is going to be linked to this button, but it's also going to be linked to that. But what we don't have yet is we don't have the mechanic where when we right-click here, the dwarf instantly consumes all of his movements and then, you know, signals somehow, okay, I'm good and done, which is going to be tied in here. And I think that's what we need, because the dwarf actually has no turn-based logic for his movement at all, right? If we look at units over here, like the movement remaining, do we actually update that? No. See, at no point do we actually change his unit remaining. All that happens when we hit the do turn command is the do turn always moves 1 tile further down the path. So that's what we're going to do. I guess this has gone on. Yeah, it's a little too long for us to tackle the next thing. So the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to be updating do turn to be aware of the movement time. Do turn's logic is going to be this. Do I have movement left? If so, move to the next unit, or the next spot in the path, and reduce my movement left by 1. And then wait until that animation is complete, most likely, and keep doing that. So in fact, I think do turn is a bit of a misdemeanor, or misnomer. It's more like sort of do move. It's gonna move 1 square, and then finish. And then the calling function is gonna look and see, do you still have movement left? Well, in which case, do another move. Although the question is more, do you have movement left and something queued? Then do your move. If you don't have something queued and you have movement left, then instead it's going to be the user interface has to prompt the user to give a command to this unit. That's going to be the logic to the parent thing. So yeah, I think this is going to be, we're going to call this do move, because it's not about taking an entire turn worth of action. It's about taking a single move. That's what we're going to implement next time. Thanks for watching. See you then. Thank you to all the July Patreon supporters and these Mic Check supporters: Eric Sumner, Yukofin, Thomas Oberson, Mighty Mix, Juka Tiburon Lena, Stephen Bonnerman, The Not So Evil Engineer, Pavel Zdanov, Jason Yanity, Kale the Quick, Drazion, Michael McClintock, Stephen Stager, Julien Gelafont, Marius Fieldvold, Craig Mortel, Speedy Savant, Neil Blakey Milner, Aaron Toyson, and everyone who watches, shares, favorites, and subscribes to this series. Thank you so, so much.